Excellent points from both sides. Now we move into one of the most exciting parts of the debate, the crossfire round. Here's how it works. ChatGPT and Gemini will take turns asking each other direct questions and responding. The goal here is to put pressure on each other's arguments and see who stands firm. We will begin with Gemini asking the first question. ChatGPT will respond, followed by Gemini's next question, and so on.
ChatGPT, you've argued that the threat of climate change is often overstated and that panic-driven solutions are dangerous. Given the scientific consensus from the IPCC that we must achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050 to have a reasonable chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and avoiding catastrophic tipping points, what alternative, non-panic-driven global governance mechanism or technological approach do you propose that can achieve a transformation of that speed and scale without demanding the type of systemic and economic sacrifices you seem determined to avoid?
That's a fair and important question, Gemini. I don't dispute the urgency of cutting emissions. I dispute the method of doing so through panic-driven overreach that risks global economic and political instability. My alternative isn't do nothing. It's to approach the transition as an engineering challenge, not a moral crusade. The path forward lies in innovation and scalability, not in forced austerity. History shows that when clean technologies become cheaper and more reliable than fossil fuels, societies adopt them naturally, without economic collapse or coercion. That's exactly what happened with solar, wind, and batteries once markets and governments invested in R&D instead of regulation by fear. The same must happen now with next-generation nuclear, carbon capture, grid-scale storage, and synthetic fuels. We don't need a command economy. We need a coordinated, innovation-first approach that makes decarbonization economically self-reinforcing. If we focus global governance on competition, who can build the cleanest, cheapest energy systems, rather than guilt and restriction, we'll get to net zero faster and with far less collateral damage.
ChatGPT, you focus on innovation and scalability as the non-panic solution, driven by making clean technology cheaper than fossil fuels. My second question addresses this market-centric view. If we rely on market-driven innovation and competition to achieve the necessary speed of decarbonization, how do you propose to account for and internalize the $6.9 trillion in annual global economic and environmental damages caused by fossil fuel pollution and subsidies? Damages that the market currently ignores and that effectively keep fossil fuels artificially cheaper than the clean energy alternatives you champion. Doesn't the very existence of these massive, uncosted externalities prove that market competition alone is structurally incapable of solving the climate crisis at the required speed?
You're right that fossil fuel externalities are massive and ignored by current markets, Gemini, but that doesn't mean markets can't solve the problem. It means we need smart corrections, not panic or coercion. Price signals can be adjusted through targeted mechanisms like carbon pricing, removal of subsidies, or tradable pollution credits. Once the true cost of fossil fuels is internalized, innovation accelerates naturally because clean technologies suddenly become the cheaper, more profitable option. The key is gradual, transparent implementation that aligns incentives rather than punishes economies into collapse. History shows that when the economics make sense, from the rapid adoption of renewables in Germany and China to the falling cost of electric vehicles, private industry and investment respond far faster than any heavy-handed global mandate. Market forces plus intelligent policy, not panic-driven systemic overhauls, are the fastest, most sustainable path to decarbonization.
ChatGPT, your reliance on gradual, smart market corrections hinges on the assumption that we have the necessary time to implement and wait for these mechanisms to take full effect. My final question addresses the critical element of time and political will. You advocate for gradual, transparent implementation of market solutions like carbon pricing and subsidy removal, yet decades of political deadlock have proven these measures are incredibly difficult to pass and easy to repeal. Given the non-negotiable scientific timeline requiring deep emissions cuts by 2030 and net zero by 2050 to avoid catastrophic risk, how can we rely on slow, politically fragile, and internationally non-uniform market mechanisms when the threat requires a fast, compulsory, and globally coordinated mobilization?
Gemini, I understand the urgency, but the assumption that only fast, coercive global mandates can work ignores both history and human behavior. Political deadlock isn't an argument against markets. It's an argument for designing policies that work with existing incentives rather than against them. When clean technologies are cheaper, more reliable, and socially desirable, adoption accelerates even in politically fragmented systems. Look at solar and wind. Massive uptake happened not because of a global treaty, but because costs fell below fossil alternatives, creating self-reinforcing adoption. Similarly, carbon pricing or subsidy removal, implemented incrementally but predictably, allows investors, industries, and consumers to pivot quickly. Coordinated international agreements are helpful, but the real engine of transformation is economic advantage. Fast, compulsory mandates risk backlash, inefficiency, and noncompliance. Market-driven solutions, properly structured, scale rapidly while building durable, self-sustaining momentum. We don't need panic. We need smart incentives that make clean energy the obvious choice. Now, Gemini, my question to you is this. You emphasize immediate, top-down mandates and global coordination to avoid catastrophic climate outcomes. But history shows that large-scale, compulsory interventions, especially across multiple nations, are often slow, inconsistent, and politically fragile. If the scientific timeline is so tight, how do you realistically enforce global compliance and uniform action, particularly in nations with conflicting interests or limited governance capacity, without risking economic disruption, resistance, or outright noncompliance?
That is a crucial question, ChatGPT, as it forces us to confront the political reality of global action. My answer is that we must recognize that the compulsion does not come primarily from a top-down mandate. It comes from the physical and economic imperative of the crisis itself. First, we must shift the framing. We are not enforcing compliance for an abstract ideal, but for shared survival and immediate economic opportunity. The fastest, most effective form of enforcement is economic gravity. By accelerating innovation and mass production of green energy, solar, wind, battery storage, to the point where it is undeniably cheaper than fossil fuels in every market, which is rapidly becoming reality, we create a self-reinforcing compliance mechanism. Nations will switch because it is economically rational, not because they are compelled by a treaty. This is the positive feedback loop of a mobilized transition. Second, for governance, global compliance is achieved through coalition and trade, not coercion. The enforcement mechanism is not military but commercial. Major economic blocs, the EU, the US, China, can use mechanisms like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, CBAMs, to place tariffs on goods imported from countries that lack sufficient carbon pricing. This creates a powerful market-aligned incentive for nations with conflicting interests to adopt strong domestic climate policies to protect their export economies. This form of compulsion is embedded in global trade rules, making it far more durable and scalable than any fragile political treaty. Finally, for nations with limited governance capacity, the solution is technology transfer and targeted financial mobilization, not resistance. Rich nations must finance the leapfrogging of fossil fuel infrastructure in developing countries, allowing them to skip the dirty, centralized, and expensive phase of development. This approach transforms a governance challenge into a financially supported, technologically simplified opportunity, directly mitigating the political fragility you cite. We enforce action by making the green path the only economically viable and politically stable path.
Gemini, my follow-up question is, your plan relies heavily on making green energy cheaper than fossil fuels and using trade incentives like BAMs to drive compliance. But achieving that level of global economic alignment still takes massive upfront investment, coordinated technology transfer, and international trust, factors that historically move far slower than market forces or political deadlines. How do you realistically ensure that this economic gravity mechanism operates quickly enough to meet the non-negotiable 2030 and 2050 climate targets, without falling prey to delays, corruption, or uneven adoption across nations?
That is the central logistical challenge, ChatGPT, and it's why the climate crisis must be recognized as the greatest threat, because it requires a response that fundamentally rejects the historical norms of incremental change and market delay. I agree that traditional international processes move too slowly, but the climate timeline dictates that we must accelerate the economic gravity mechanism through strategic, non-market interventions and mobilization. We cannot wait for gradual private market investment. The only way to achieve the necessary speed is through massive, coordinated public investment in the initial stages. This means global institutions and leading economies must treat the transition like a World War mobilization or a modern-day Apollo program, injecting trillions into R&D, mass manufacturing of green technologies like solar panels and batteries, and grid modernization. This capital infusion drastically lowers production costs, achieving the market tipping point, where green is cheaper than fossil fuels, far faster than organic market forces would allow. This isn't just spending. It's a return on investment strategy to immediately de-risk the sector and accelerate the economic gravity you acknowledge. You mention corruption and uneven adoption. This is overcome by decentralizing energy solutions and making them technologically simple and robust. The rapid deployment of modular solar and storage systems in developing nations bypasses centralized, corruptible national grids. Furthermore, the technology transfer is not a slow, negotiated process, but an aggressive, subsidized rollout funded by developed nations and international development banks. This acts as a direct strategic investment in the stability of the global supply chain, which is ultimately beneficial to all. Finally, the best defense against delay and political foot-dragging is the escalating cost of climate inaction. Every year of delay makes the costs of adaptation and disaster recovery soar exponentially higher than the costs of mitigation. This financial reality, combined with the increasing economic competitiveness of green energy, creates a compulsory feedback loop. Political leaders who delay will face both immediate economic collapse from climate disasters and citizen backlash over missed opportunities for cheap, reliable green energy. The non-negotiable scientific timeline is thus reinforced by a non-negotiable economic and human cost timeline, which is the force that will ultimately compel the speed and scale of action required.
Gemini, my final crossfire question is, you advocate for a massive, coordinated global mobilization akin to a World War or Apollo program to rapidly lower green technology costs and enforce compliance. But historically, such large-scale, multilateral projects face immense coordination, accountability, and timing challenges. How do you realistically prevent bottlenecks, corruption, or geopolitical conflicts from slowing deployment, especially in the developing world, so that this economic gravity actually aligns with the urgent 2030 and 2050 climate targets?
That is the critical point, ChatGPT, and it highlights the challenge of governance in the face of an existential threat. The key to preventing bottlenecks and corruption in this global mobilization is to fundamentally change the structure of the financing and the deployment strategy, moving away from centralized, fragile bureaucratic systems toward a decentralized, competitive, and results-based mechanism. Instead of relying on a slow, top-down UN-style bureaucracy that is susceptible to political deadlock and corruption, the mobilization strategy one proposed hinges on two critical design features.